Well, you're watching Richo and Jones, and Richo's not with us tonight. He's not well, but he wouldn't want anyone to be alarmed. He's going to be okay. I mentioned before the break the extent to which the taxpayer-funded Bureau of Meteorology has been shown to have doctored and manipulated figures to suit the climate change theory. Now, an Australian scientist, Dr. Jennifer Massey, had a look at some of its figures, one in particular in relation to a little outfit called Rutherglen. And at Rutherglen in Victoria, she found that they had quote-unquote homogenised the temperatures over the last 100 years. So where the temperatures over 100 years had demonstrated a cooling trend, they were homogenised, I'll come to that in a moment, to demonstrate a warming trend. Why did they do this homogenisation? Well, the Bureau of Meteorology said you couldn't rely on the thermometer because it was located on a hill. Jennifer Massey was too smart for all of that. She checked it out and found that the thermometer had never been anywhere near a hill. So, Professor Monckton, here we go again. This is a taxpayer-funded entity which has been doctoring raw data.
This is appalling. I'm not surprised. The Bureau of Meteorology has proven to be very untrustworthy on the subject of climate change throughout. Like so many other bodies of its kind around the world, one thinks of NIWA in New Zealand, which has done exactly the same thing. Likewise in the United States, the NASA GIS has done it just again last month, jacking up all the recent temperatures, even though the satellites are watching and shows that they're cheating. It's happened in the UK, of course, at the University of East Anglia. This fiddling to try to make it look as though there's been more global warming than there has now been so extensive worldwide that one can no longer trust the terrestrial data record at all, and the only record on which I now rely is the satellite record, because that can't be tampered with.
Well, just for the benefit of viewers, I'll get Christopher Monckton's comment on this, but if you take a place that we all know in Australia, Burke, the temperature at Burke, the raw data at Burke in 1909 was 51.7 degrees. We all know that Burke is very, very hot. That was homogenised down to 44 degrees. Why? Well, of course, how are you going to prove there's been global warming if your starting point in 1909 is 51.7? So you better knock the 51.7 down to 44 point something, 44 and a bit, so that as you see the temperatures at Burke climbing to 46, 48 and 50 and whatever, hello, we've got global warming. But the raw data has been doctored.
Not only have they doctored the raw data at that end, earlier in the century, to push it down and make it look as though there's been more warming than there has, but they've also relocated, for instance in Sydney, the key thermometer to an area where it's much more likely to pick up what's called urban heat island effects from concrete and concrete walls and surrounding flats churning out their air conditioning heat waste into the air around the sensor. So there's a lot of this going on too, and they are not correcting for that properly. No. A very interesting paper came out 6 years ago showing that there was a correlation which shouldn't have existed between where the temperature sensor was and what the industrial activity was there and the change in temperature. And if they had correctly allowed for the urban heat island effect, that could not have happened. So every one of these terrestrial records is worthless. And the only thing to use now is the satellite record.
Right. Just explain about this is what they think they mean by homogenisation.
What they think they mean is that, let's take Rutherglen, the one you mentioned. They're saying that there was a change in the position of the thermometer, and that therefore that has to be corrected for, and it hadn't been corrected for before. However, Jennifer Massey, who is a very formidable researcher, extremely careful with what she does, went back and checked and said, okay, where is there any evidence that this temperature thermometer had ever been moved, and if it had been moved, that the move was significant? And they were unable to supply the information. So they simply made it up. I'm afraid that's the only conclusion that one can come to.
So 0.35 of a degree over 100 years of cooling is suddenly transferred to 1.75 degrees of warming.
Now you do that in enough places around the world, and you can make it look as though there's been much more global warming than there has. I think, to be fair, there has been some, but I guess it's probably 0.3, 0.4 Celsius and not 0.7, 0.8. It's about half what they say it is.
But come back to the starting point of all of this. Here is this phenomenal amount of money being wasted. over carbon dioxide. It used to be called climate change, then it was called global warming. When 97% of that carbon dioxide is naturally occurring, that roughly arguing about 3% in the world is man-made, and Australia, little tiny Australia, doing hardly anything at all, and yet here we are with every instrument of climate change, of bureaucracy out of control, contributing $100 billion a year to propagandise the climate change argument. When is there anyone apart from Stephen Harper and Tony Abbott and a few of those people who are prepared to wake up?
Well, certainly when Sir David King, who is the climate change ambassador...
I think he's a chemist, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He knows nothing about the climate. I debated with him on it, and he came off very much third best.
He's got a hybrid, anyway.
Yeah, of course he has. He goes around the world whispering in the ears of countries...
Well, our ambassadors, aren't they? They're appointed to persuade everybody to come on side.
To regulate everybody into life. But he was interviewed by the Environmentalist Committee of the House of Commons, chaired by a guy who makes $100,000 to $200,000 a year out of being chairman of wind farm companies, and he admitted then that there were only two holdout countries in the whole world that they couldn't count on. One was Canada, and the other was, of course, Australia. And he said of Canada, of course, there'll be elections in 2015, and we will make sure that Mr. Harper will not win them. He was quite open about it. They are now going to go after anyone who stands out. That's why Tony Abbott's going to come under a lot of pressure. They really want to get him out.
Even though he's going to be in New York tomorrow for the terrorism summit, he's not there today for the climate change.
Very sensible too. Julie Bishop is more than competent to handle it for you.
Let's just take one point that's been written into the language of climate change, that 97% of scientists agree that climate change is an urgent man-made problem. Now, you're aware of Joseph Bast and Roy Spencer. They're both very eminent people.
Yes.
And they wrote in the Wall Street Journal on May 26th this year, maintaining that this so-called consensus, quote, is a fiction, and it came, quote, from a handful of surveys and abstract counting exercises that have been contradicted by more reliable research. Oh, that's the Wall Street Journal.
That's right, and I was one of those who did the research, and it's peer-reviewed and published, because this figure of 97% of scientists came from an extremely bad piece of research at the University of Queensland, which is currently about to be referred to the police because there are questions about its integrity. I better not go into any more detail than that in case you get sued for libel, but let us just say that there are very, very grave concerns about that research. We expose the defects of it. Do you know what the true consensus is to the effect that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us? It wasn't 97.1%, as that paper claimed. Their own markings of the 11,944 papers that they examined showed only 64 papers that they had marked, the researchers had marked, as supporting their definition of the consensus. And that's 0.5% consensus, not 97.1%. It was a straight falsehood, and a very serious one.
If you take someone like, just finally, if you take someone like Richard Toll, who is the 20th most cited climate scholar in the world.
Yes, he's an economist. That's his main field.
Quite. He resigned last May from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he said this: the panel is directed from within the environmental lobby and not from within the science.
This is quite true. I can give you a very good example of this. In 2007, the UN's climate panel said that the Himalayan glaciers would be entirely gone, all the ice gone, in 25 years. That came from a climate communist researcher who wasn't even a researcher, he was a journalist. And they have just lifted this because it suited the party.
Right, well,
they don't do science anymore.
We just had a report this month that the sea ice in the Antarctic has expanded to its greatest coverage since records began in 1978. A 3-year record-breaking run means there are nearly 20 million, it said, square kilometres of ice in the Antarctic, 2.5 times the size of Australia. How does that fit the global warming theory?
It doesn't, of course, and this has been happening throughout the last 30 years, that Antarctica sea ice has been growing, and in fact, for each of the last 12 days, it has set a new record, and it's extraordinary how rapidly it's increased, in fact, almost worrying, because it looks as though we could be in for some serious cooling if this carries on. In the Arctic, there's been something of a decline there, but globally, there has been no trend, a zero trend. Again, another of these horizontal lines in sea ice. If you take the Antarctic and the Arctic together, according to Cryosphere Today in the University of Illinois, where they keep the records, and that's been so throughout the satellite record, no change in the global extent of sea ice at all, zero.
Good to talk to you. Good to talk to you, though. I'll keep trying to silence you, I guess, but you'll keep talking.
I'll keep talking, Evan, and so will you, and God bless you. And we will bring this scare very soon to an end. The scientists are still working on it, and in the end, we will find that silver bullet which will prove to everyone that they're talking rot. In the meantime, all you have to do is look at the monthly temperature record, which is posted at climatedepot.com, and you'll find it there every month. You won't find it almost anywhere else because the world's media have conspired to hide the fact that global temperatures have simply not been rising. And you surely think that that was an interesting and relevant fact if you're talking about global warming, and there isn't any.
Good on you. Good to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
Bless you.
Lord Monckton, we'll take a break and be back after that.